Okay, now we're going to get onto the war itself, like and why the Americans won the war. We'll start. We decided we'd break it down by strengths and like kind of weaknesses of each side first, and then we'll deal with the external factors and how they come into play, and I suppose the events of the war a little bit. We'll start with the initial bit. So when you're looking at the start of the war, I think the British strengths are that, well, the first British strength obviously is they're the global superpower at that time. So I think that that generally is
That's a good strength.
it's quite a significant strength to have in the cycle. But at the same time, you could say that's a weakness, because the fact that they're the global superpower makes them underestimate everyone else.
Yeah, that's right. I think so.
And they think it's inevitable that they're going to win. So I don't think they plan strategically as they would do for, an enemy they actually consider can beat them.
Yeah. But I mean, if you look at it, if you're looking at, say it was like two boxers in a ring.
Yeah.
You've got a heavyweight versus a lightweight. Like, I mean, Britain's population is, I think, 8 million.
Yeah.
The population of the colonies is 2.5 million. 500,000 of those are slaves. Yeah, because it's a pretty big difference.
That is. Although they've read the Bible and they should have read David and Goliath, they should know how this goes.
I'm sure they thought of David and Goliath during this.
Yeah, but obviously not in the right way. They'd also seen, to be honest, the Quebecois in the War of Austrian Succession had actually managed to hold them off with a 15-1 disadvantage. But then they smashed them in the 7 Years' War. They kind of used the same tactics on the colonists they used on the Quebecois. Do you think they thought they would just take them out in that way, not realizing that the colonists had a lot more advantages that the Quebecois didn't have?
I'm not familiar with the 7 Years' War conflict. Yeah, that's a bit of a gap.
They cut them off to block them from bringing in imports and exports, which is of course what the British did.
I see.
Third, but the Quebecois, because their land in Canada was not very good and they can't really grow any crops, they were starved out effectively. But that wouldn't apply to the colonists because they had the breadbasket of like Pennsylvania and New York and would have been able to supply themselves with food.
Yeah, I think so.
Except for the Americans were buying it with monopoly money, which was the only problem.
That's right.
Didn't really want
it. Yeah. So Britain's a superpower.
Yeah.
It's got a much bigger population.
Yeah.
It's got significant military superiority, right, in terms of manpower.
I think only in terms of the Navy. Because the British Army is not a good army. It's not one of the best in the world.
No, but we're comparing it to the Americans.
But the Americans had fought alongside them. I don't think I think the superiority in naval power is, obviously you've got the world's greatest Navy versus the tugboat coalition or whatever the hell the Americans created.
I think they've just got a dinghy.
Flotilla.
They've got a dinghy.
Dunkirk's the Dunkirk evacuation.
It's probably leaking. That's the American Navy.
Like small boats, like the local yachting club versus the world's greatest Navy, or whatever the hell the Americans put together. I'm sure there'll be, if any Americans ever listen to this, I'm sure there'll be people complaining about disparaging of their but it was just pieced together ships versus the world's greatest Navy. I think is massive. But the army, the British Army, what they hadn't won any. They've never been great at winning battles with the army.
Yeah, but they've still got. They've got what, nearly 50,000 men apparently.
Yeah.
They're facing America has to basically build its army from zero. They have to recruit militiamen from.
But these soldiers have a motivation. They're fighting for their own lives, colonies, families.
Sure,
whereas the British Army are paid soldiers over there doing a job.
Yeah, but we're just looking at numbers.
Okay,
that's right.
Yeah, okay, in terms of numbers, but of course the Americans have a potential of 1.25 million potential soldiers if they want them. Yeah. Whereas the British aren't really going to recruit that many loyalists.
What about the Hessians? They've got the Hessians as well.
Yes, which is an advantage because they're a mercenary force, but it's a disadvantage because they're a mercenary force. They're fighting for money. They're not disciplined. And I think that they add to that feeling of despotic foreigners because a British government is using foreign soldiers against their own civilians.
Yeah, that's right.
Imagine that now. Just imagine it now. if Rishi Sunak decided he wanted to hire foreign mercenaries to put down British people protesting in Cornwall, I think how would the public view it?
True. Probably wouldn't be that happy.
No,
they wouldn't be that happy anyway.
No, they wouldn't. But the fact that it's foreign,
yeah. But the Royal Navy, the Great British Navy, again, it's well, it is the number one naval power, right?
Yeah, and I'll just add to that because, of course, my students know, but I'll put it. The British always had the policy that their navy must be bigger than the second and third biggest navies in the world.
That's right.
So that if they're unified together, they would still be able to beat them. I think that when we get to external factors, that's really important because they end up against the second, third, and fourth biggest because the Dutch join.
Yes, that's right.
And they don't have the capability to take on all of
it. But none of that's clear at this point.
No.
This is later.
But of course, I think for a chance, if you've got the neighborhood bully and the neighborhood bully is getting a bloody nose from a little kid, the other kids decide this is the moment to pile on.
That's right. Exactly. That's exactly. I was thinking of that analogy.
Yeah, it's like the little bullies. This little kid's like, I'm not going to let you take my lunch money anymore. The bully is like, all right, well, I'm going to kick the crap out of you. The little kid gets a couple of lucky shots in, get totally creamed, and the other kids decide now is the moment to kick the crap out of the bully.
Have you been in that situation, James?
No.
On either side of that.
No,
on either side of that equation.
No, I think that is a fair analogy of this situation.
I think it is. Okay, so there's that, but now there's also the financial differences.
Yeah.
Britain has obviously a much greater financial power.
Yeah.
It's than America does. America has huge financial problems. As we mentioned, paper money.
Only if you don't trust the monopoly money, otherwise they've got unlimited.
Yeah, that's right.
Unlimited monopoly money. They've got lots of it. So.
That's right.
But equally, yes, that's true. Britain has more finances, but they also have bigger responsibilities. They've got a whole empire to run. So it's like that money can't be all diverted at one target, whereas the Americans have only one issue to deal with.
That's right. But we'll get to that when we talk about British weaknesses.
Oh, yeah. But I think we flip sides of the strengths into weaknesses make sense because they have to do counter arguments in their essays. So it makes it easy to knock them out if they're just dealing with them.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
What other
so there's that. So the other strength that I got was, well, obviously Britain has its empire. It's got many bases from which it can launch attacks.
Yeah.
Basically from all sides, and even from the West, right? Because it's got agreements with the Indians, so they can get the Indians to harry the colonists from the West. They can attack from Canada.
For a second, I thought you meant Indians from India, and I was like, "What?" I was like, "Native Americans, yeah."
Sorry, I guess it's politically incorrect to say Indians. Native Americans, and from Florida, and the West Indies, right? So the Caribbean islands. They have quite a lot of flexibility from that perspective. Now, the flip side of that is you have a lot of territory to defend.
Yeah, and that's big.
A hell of a lot of territory to defend and limited resources in which to defend it.
Yeah, and you rely on that navy to do it. So you know what I mean. And like I said, the British have always relied. The Germans do their fighting for them. Even in the 7 Years' War, the Prussians did the land fighting for them. So they've been used, and that's ironic because the Prussians end up training Washington's army, and the Prussians are at this moment the best.
Yeah, and I think that's it's been Britain's policy ever since, hasn't it?
Until World War I and World War II, it was like
you have
the Germans. They do the fighting for us against the French. Keep the French occupied. We steal all the territory around the world. That's right. Simplified version of British foreign policy.
That's right. Okay, so.
But I want to add to that then that the fact that that does end up being really problematic, and I know we're jumping around, but we'll come back to it in its proper place as well. But it's important to interlock it because these teams interlock as they can. But that empire to defend becomes really important when French, Spanish, and Dutch come in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're fighting for the Spice Islands down there. The French are reenacting the fights in India. The French are going after the Caribbean islands, as are the Spanish, and the Caribbean islands. Isn't hard. The Caribbean islands for the sugar trade was the most vital and part of the British Empire. Was making way more money than the colonists were making for them. And then obviously the Spanish then put pressure on Gibraltar, on Minorca, on the bases, which is like they need that to get to the empire. These are the trade routes through, and it's like defending
So
all
that's
these more
that's a
profitable
liability.
colonies.
That's, you
Yeah,
could say that's a liability that the British have.
massive.
That's the
Well,
problem of
it's
having
definitely a liability that could be exploited, and I think that's the key. Is that and until the bloody nose, which is like, let's say Saratoga's the punch in the face from the little kid.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think
So
that's
that
right.
the French and Spanish are like, I don't want to fight this bully because Britain has been kicking their ass effectively in the wars recently. So they're like, no. And when the Americans knock them back, they're like, ooh, the British are not as, you know what I mean? It's not as strong as they think they are. It's a bit like, I suppose it's like the ancient world, like, when the Japanese rolled through the whole of the British Empire in World War II, and that meant all the Asian colonies were like, hang on a minute, these white people are not invincible. This Asian country has absolutely crashed them. And that inevitably led to the breakup and independence of all of the Asian empire.
Yeah.
I think a similar kind of effect where the Americans giving them a bloody nose was like, this is the moment. Like, it's now or never. You know what I mean? The British are really trapped in now. Yeah. I mean, if you look at it later on, like Napoleon in 1804, when he sold Louisiana Purchase, said that he was creating America to be the biggest rival to Britain. And he thought it was the only thing that could dethrone the British Empire. He thought in 200 years they'd do it. And he was right, because they were about nearly 100 years earlier, but he wasn't wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so
any other strengths you think the British have?
No, that's basically what I've got.
The only out and out strength they have is the Navy, because everything else comes with problems.
Yeah, and the problem with the Navy is that the Navy's useful for blockading ports.
Yeah,
it's useful for transporting men back and forth. It's useful for supplying or resupplying an army.
Yeah,
right, or reinforcing it. But you can't go in. You need the army to go inland, right? So if you're looking for a decisive battle, if you want to crush Washington's the Continental Army, you're going to need land forces to do that. So I mean, this is one of the interesting points: is what possible strategies could Britain have employed to lead to a better outcome? And one may have been to rely more on the Navy, to rely on its strength.
I think,
but no, I don't think so. I don't think that.
I don't think that Britain could have won this war because of the nature of what winning means.
I disagree. Yeah, no, I disagree. But I agree with you that we have to determine the conditions for victory, because they're very different from either side.
Yeah.
Right. So what winning means depends on your conditions, right?
Yeah. The Americans need to survive.
Exactly. The Americans just need to hang on.
Can you put a huge continent to hide in?
It's not that easy. It's not that easy. So let's look at this scenario. Imagine, and this nearly happened, right? So imagine if General Howe, had, so jumping ahead again, but he beats Washington in New York.
Yeah, if he'd have captured him at Long Island, that was the moment.
If he'd surrounded and destroyed the Continental Army and forced it to surrender.
Yeah.
Right. And he'd done so decently. So he hadn't committed any major atrocity to anger. To further aggravate anti-British sentiment. Yeah. Then it's pretty easy. It's quite possible that they could have negotiated a favorable peace under British terms.
I think that was the moment. If there was any moment, it was the capture at Long Island. If they had taken him on the retreat from Long Island, Howard got Washington then. Because I think the only way they could win was the Americans to give up. And the only way the Americans were going to give up is if they thought it wasn't possible. There were other moments as well. Maybe that's why Trenton was so important for morale. And that's why like Saratoga was critical. Because once Saratoga happened, they were never going to give up after Saratoga.
I don't know. I mean, I think there are still potentially other things could have gone the other way in several of these other events, and it may have been possible to have demoralized the Americans enough to at least go to the negotiating table under more favorable conditions.
Maybe, but I still I mean, what do you think the best case scenario for the British would have been? Because the problem would have been,
that's a really good question. Yeah, that's a good question.
Even if they'd got it back, they would have still had the same problems.
Yeah.
They would
This
still
is
have,
the problem.
they would still have
Yeah.
problems of westward expansion. They would still, because once the Americans get independent, they themselves still have the same problems and have to deal with them. Because the fundamental thing is the problems and the reasons, the causes of the conflict are still there. They don't go away.
Yeah.
They still want
And
westward
look, that's
expansion.
right. That's basically the paradox of the British position, isn't it? Because the British, let's say that the British really went, as we might say, do you say that? Hammer and tongs.
Yeah.
They go all out, throw
All
the kitchen sink
blazing.
at these people, all guns blazing.
Yeah.
Right. Say that they destroy completely, that they went in a lot harder. They can win, and they can win as many battles as they like.
Yeah.
Right. That's not going to change, as you might say, the hearts and minds. It won't change the loyalties of colonists that are angry against the British and are willing to hurt them at any point. Yeah. I think that's basically the problem, and maybe it's that paradox that explains why the British, after Cornwallis is defeated in Virginia, in 1783.
81, the battle. And then
sorry, 1781. Pardon me. When he's defeated in 1781, the British basically give up.
Yeah.
They didn't have to give up.
Yeah.
So victory conditions quite hard. So England has to. I think for the British, they have to defeat the Americans on pitched ground, on a pitched battle. They have to destroy their army without annoying the colonists, without aggravating the colonists so much that there's going to be more rebellions. So it's a very strange situation where you're fighting an enemy, but you don't want to hurt them so much that they regard you as a, kind of tyrannical enemy.
They've seen it now. The Americans now see it as tyranny, and they now see it as despotism. So to accept a peace means to accept slavery, effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And this is from a people that know what slavery is, because they have it in their southern colonies. And they would see that as accepting slavery. So would they, knowing what that means and knowing what they're imposing on African Americans in the South, would they accept that in what they see it as ever? So could it have been possible for the British to impose it, short of absolutely massacring all of the colonial elite? And
no, they couldn't do it that way. No, so I think the British are very aware of this. They're aware that they can't obliterate the colonies, even though they have probably the capacity to do so. They can't bombard New York with their ships. They can't massacre troops or massacre citizens. It's quite a restrained. It's there, with some exceptions, particularly in the South, right? Yeah. It's quite a restrained war, all things considered.
And it's Tarleton's quarter.
Yeah, but he's that's right. No, but he's the exception, isn't he?
He is, but of course the Americans on every one of these opportunities as propaganda victories.
Yeah.
They are propaganda.
Yeah, that's true. What about America? So we haven't really talked a lot about.
Let's look at a couple more strengths, because I've got a couple more in the suburbs.
Oh yeah, sure.
They have a fully professional army. I know we talked about them having more numbers, but theirs is fully professional. Whereas I think we didn't really fully pull that out. Whereas the Americans obviously have, it's basically a militia force. I mean, they've created an army, but that army is only created under the Second Continental Congress. And it's not a permanent army, which is why there's a problem under the Articles of Confederation when it's disbanded. It's for wartime only, and it's going to be disbanded.
Which means that soldiers that have farms and businesses and things like that, they're not going to stick. They might be in your army for a month or a couple of months when they're called up, but then they go back home.
Yeah. And it's seasonal,
like professional army.
So we're not fighting now; it's crop gathering season.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Yeah, we'll come back later. It's that's kind of a slightly. I suppose this is battles in that time period, though. Even in that time period, you would meet up, and if it was raining, they would agree to postpone it till the next day. It's just not the same world with things that are just insanely weird to us. But there was still that idea of classic, chivalry and generalship. And I think, do you think this and the 7 Years' War are kind of the first moves towards a modern war? I know, everyone always says the U.S. Civil War was the first, no holds barred proper war.
Yeah. And that was nasty. I mean, that absolutely, compared to this.
Yeah.
This is nothing compared to what happens in the Civil War.
No.
In terms of the number of people killed.
No.
And the ferocity of the fighting.
Yeah.
Um,
Although
but
Washington does attack on Christmas Day, which is very ungentlemanly.
you can't attack on Christmas Day.
Yeah. Trenton attack is on Christmas Day, a winter campaign, and that's what catches the Hessians
Is
on
that
fire.
the only time? Well, that's the only time he's successful, isn't it?
Yeah, he
It's
is.
one of
Yeah,
his only successes. So
yeah,
military successes, I should say.
yeah. That Christian symbolism of being on Christmas Day. I mean, the Massachusetts people must have loved that.
I know.
Or maybe they
But
would. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd have seen it as like, terrible to attack on Christmas Day. And
I don't think they would have. Aren't they, these Puritans? They don't even like Christmas. Too much celebration. Too much
that
fun.
is true. Yes, that is true. Sorry, I forgot they're Cromwellian. They're Cromwellian Puritans. It's like, fun is bad. So yeah. No fun
But
stuff there.
is it possible that are you overstating though the British military professionalism? Because I think that there were a lot of troops apart from being spread out.
Yeah.
The British Army being spread out. I think that many of the recruits really hadn't seen much fighting before.
No, because Britain keep winning when the Navy's not to do any land fighting. I think some of British soldiers had been over in the 7 Years' War fighting in Europe, but I believe some of the Americans had been as well. So I think there were people with experience of war on both sides.
Yeah. I have another question too. So
Yeah.
this is regarding British weakness.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that British leadership, so Lord North,
Yeah.
right, his prime minister,
Yeah.
right? To what extent to what extent is British leadership and even the British generals,
Yeah.
really committed to this? So
Not as much as they could do, because I think they see about winning the peace afterwards, and they've got friends there. They still see them as British, which I think is important. I think how, and I don't know what it is exactly, but Howe has some sort of marriage connection to some of the elite Americans. I don't remember if it's his daughter or something like that. So Howe has relationships with the Americans on a personal level. And of course, you have to remember, until war breaks out, these people were not British and Americans. They were living in New York together.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they would have been the elite. And because the elites are running the rebellion, except Sam Adams, and even then, I'm pretty sure he probably had connections among the elites. Like they would have been friends. It's a bit like they were talking about the U.S. Civil War. Like a lot of these generals on either side had been at West Point together and had been friends when they were younger. And even when they were fighting each other and killing each other in the war, they were writing each other letters, being like,
absolutely.
We whooped your asses. Like,
right.
Just joking about things. Because the way they saw it was like, this is a war, but at the end of the war, we will be back to being friends, as opposed to this is, I think that's that difference between how the British treated their other colonies of like, we don't know these people, we're just going to crush them. So I think that's right. That makes a big difference. I mean, the incompetence of the generals was quite high, and we'll talk about that in general. So if we look at the weaknesses, I'll just have one more strength and then I'll pivot back to that. The British had Native Americans on side, and some Southerners, and some of the slaves obviously supported the British, because the Native Americans, it was not in their interest for the Americans to win this, because there was only one inevitable thing going to happen with westward expansion if the British win this. They're going to, if the Americans win it, the Native Americans knew that they're dead if the British win it, if the Americans win this. And obviously African Americans is not in their interest to be. I mean, I know the British were supporting the slave trade at this point. Tactically, the British did offer to free all slaves that fought on the side of them, which is I don't know if that's the basis for the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln went, "Oh, that worked as a tactic," but it ended up with them. The South was quite loyal to the British because they benefited from mercantilism. But the moment the British offered to free the slaves, I think this was a strategic mistake for them, because the Southern planters immediately turned to the rebellion.
I agree.
The South was going to be on the rebel side. They would never.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I think appealing to the American Indians was also probably more of a liability than an advantage.
Yep, to the West,
to the British.
Again, they're seen like Pontiac's rebellion, all these things. They're seen as the enemy. So it feels like the British are just like allying with the Canadian Quebecois, because the Americans invade Canada and they lose up there against the Quebecois because they wanted to try and conquer it. So you've got the British are using German Hessian mercenaries. The Quebecois fighting down with their Quebec Act and bringing that down. The Native Americans, who were they annoyed with the Proclamation Act because they couldn't use their land, and they're freeing the African American slaves in the South. You couldn't possibly have come up with a coalition more likely to unite the Americans, because they've all got their own interests, but the British seem to have made sure that all of those interests are allied in removing them.
Yeah.
because every colony has got a different problem. The North are afraid of the Quebecois, the West are afraid of the Native Americans, the South are afraid of a slave uprising, and all of them are afraid of despotic foreign troops. So by bringing that all together in an alliance, it has them surrounded and unifies them together. All for different reasons, but they've all got their own reason to get rid of the British.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's tactical. That's a tactical mistake by the British generals and governments.
I agree.
So if you're talking about their general, I think I mean, obviously Howe, and we'll talk about more specifically the mistakes of Howe and like poor tactics of Saratoga and Yorktown specifically. But if we're talking in general, I think they wanted a negotiated settlement, like you said. So I think that means that they were inevitably going to treat them more softly, because if you've got to get, I think this is a weakness, but if you want to win the peace, you can't go in, and destroy scorched earth tactics. So that was a problem.
That's ruled out.
Yeah,
but you have to win big, because I think the problem is the Americans can afford to lose battles.
Yeah,
everyone expects them to.
Yeah,
I mean, as long as they can hold on and not get completely destroyed.
Yeah,
they're still in the game. Whereas for the British, each success, even though they win more than 80% of the battles.
I think they win every battle, every major battle.
Almost. I don't win every battle, but they win almost every battle.
But like Saratoga, Yorktown, they surrendered because they didn't have any food. They weren't beaten in battle.
Is that just?
Yeah, because
no, that's true. No, that's true.
So they didn't actually fight. So they're two
Burgoyne didn't have access to his crates of champagne anymore.
No,
that was it.
No. Brought them down. Didn't even bring them with him. And I'm not sure in the heat of a battle how much champagne is a good source of stuff. But yeah, no, he took Ticonderoga Fort on his way down. But we'll get into the more details of those battles in the next.
Yeah, but in other words, it just takes one defeat for the British, one mistake, to really weaken their position.
And boy, do they make more than one.
they make more than one, but it's like the bloody nose, isn't it? Of the big kid in the playground who's able to beat everybody up, but the moment someone stands up to that person, then could be in for trouble.
Well, if we're taking the boxing analogy, is this not like Rumble in the Jungle? When Muhammad Ali was on the ropes and just getting pummeled and pummeled and pummeled and pummeled, but he just danced around him and won.
Yeah, right.
This is the Rumble in the Jungle. The British are just pounding and pounding and pounding away, but they don't actually know how to strategically win this.
Yeah.
To be fair to the British, though, I think, like, obviously you've got a vast territory to cover with a very small army. How do you, as a Brit, Britain's tiny, America's enormous. Even the 13 colonies alone are bigger than Britain. Like, so, they've got a tiny army, and they've got to, like, it's like trying to, I don't know, it's like trying to kill ants with like when they cover a whole territory. You can't really do it. They can run anywhere.
Didn't somebody say it's like trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer?
Yeah. And it just dances around. Yeah, exactly like our little boxing analogy as well. So also distance and impossibility of running a coordinated war. They still took their orders from home, but the messages were taking 3 months to get there and back. I mean, you can't have a strategic battle campaign with a 3-month delay on decisions, because war doesn't work that way. And so, like, all of the tactical orders they were receiving were based on a position that happened like a long time ago.
Yeah,
it would be like playing chess when you're only allowed to know, like, where you've got to anticipate what move to make 10 moves down the line when you don't know what the moves would be made in the middle.
Yeah,
that's effectively what the British are playing. So whereas the Americans can respond real time. So I think it's almost impossible. They should have given full strategic control over to the generals to make the decisions on the land, because that was the obvious decision to make, and they didn't. And then Howe himself was quite sympathetic to the colonists. I mean, Howe if you're looking at like Bunker Hill, they withdrew. That was a mistake. They let the Americans take the high ground because they didn't anticipate that happening. They had to withdraw from Boston Harbor. Long Island, they defeated the colonial army. They did not capture. I mean, I think Howe's failure to capture Washington after Long Island is massively important, because that could have ended the war. I think it was probably their best chance of ending the war. And the fact that
absolutely.
The fact that they allowed him to get away. And then when he got away, obviously just running through the events, like obviously he escaped from Long Island, he gets down to Trenton, and then he winters up, and then he crosses back across the river in Trenton. And because at that point the American morale was low, they'd lost loads, they thought they were going to lose. I think the Christmas Day attack by Washington at Trenton is massively important. because he crosses back over the river, takes the Hessians by surprise, beats them, goes round Howe's army, like takes Princeton, and then retreats back for the winter. So this, even though these victories are minor, they are strategically showing that Washington still has the ability to surprise, he can be innovative, that he can win. And I think that's massively important when Saratoga, the year after Gates wins in Saratoga, Gates wants Washington's job. And I think after the win at Saratoga, he'd have got it if Washington hadn't already have those little victories at Trenton to keep him in his position.
Yeah,
I think
it's amazing. Washington has this incredible ability to hold on by the skin of his teeth, doesn't he?
Yeah, but I think that's one of the American strengths.
There's something about that he can endure these defeats.
Yeah.
And hold on.
Yeah.
Can we? I'm looking forward to going to Burgoyne. He's my favorite.
Yeah, we can get to the individuals. Let's look at I'll just cover another general points because then we can cover then we'll cover the events of the war. We need to cover the general ideas thing, and then we'll go into the more detail of the individual events on it. So
sure.
I think the British failure to get the Loyalist South on side by promising to free the slaves was massively important. I think the fact that they kept every time that Loyalists rose up to support them, they would enter an area and then they would leave. And I think that's vitally important because basically the Loyalists would then be tarred and feathered, beaten, like killed.
Yeah.
So
it's a bit like what the Americans did in Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly.
When
so
they left.
No one's going to rise up. Like no one's going to rise up to defend them because they just don't trust the British to stay and protect them. And they can't because the area is too big.
Yeah,
they've got to chase it down. So I think that, and they failed to be despotically brutal. So I think if they'd have been despotically brutal, maybe they'd have been able to do. I mean, they could have won the war, but then they would have been in the same position. The Americans would still have been unhappy, and they wouldn't have been able to solve the rebellion problem, which I think is their biggest issue.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can get. Let's just look at the tactics in general, then we can go on to the specific details of the war bits. How long have we got left on this one? We got 7 minutes.
7 minutes.
Let's just cover the American strength and weakness as well. So I think the American limitations, and I'll run through them, and you can add me if you want to. So I think there was a civil war in the southern colonies. So there was a fight between. So the southern colonies were a bit divided because the plantation elites and the backcountry were fighting their own little mini civil wars on the side about who has control over those states. I guess that was the populist uprising that Samuel Adams was pushing for, but the planter elites in the southern colonies won that. There was still limited unity in the colonies, so I think they didn't really have full unity between them. They had different interests, different objectives. They couldn't raise money collectively. They lost lots of battles. They had unprofessional soldiers until they eventually got trained at Valley Forge. And the economic situation was really difficult for them. How do they get money? They don't really have a policy of taxation, and now they can't trade. Is there any of those you want to add to, or anything you want to comment on any of those?
In terms of American weakness?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that covers it. That's what I've got here.
Yeah,
I think those are pretty significant weaknesses.
Any ones that stand out to you as more important than others as being particularly problematic for the Americans?
I think their economic weakness is very important. The inability to really be able to support a large army. I think it's amazing how small Washington's army is.
Yeah, and Gates has a small. I mean, they rely on obviously monopoly.
We're talking maximum, like at its maximum point, something like 20,000.
Yeah.
But when it gets bad, he only has about 2,000 people there.
Yeah.
With him. That's the army. 2,000. There are schools that are bigger than that.
Probably better trained at fighting as well, wasn't he? I mean, but he only needs to survive. That's the key bit. That's why Trenton's so important. But he doesn't win any battles. He doesn't need to. Just has to, because the British
does win one. He does win. He does win one too.
The British are going to run out of money. Well, obviously they know the British don't like fighting long wars and accumulating debts, because that's why they tried to tax them with the Stamp Act in the first place after the 7 Years' War. So they were like, well, if the British are so unhappy that they ended up Stamp Act taxing us because they couldn't pay for the last war, they probably just calculated how long was that war. If we can last that long, we're going to run out of money again.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
They've seen that the British can't deal with it and they'd have to tax loads and it causes rebellions. And they're probably thinking, you know what? Do you wonder if the British, by the end of this war, are thinking, if we continue this war, we're going to have to raise taxes so high at home, we may end up having this rebellion in our own country.
Yeah.
And they're like, we need to end this war to avoid this happening in Britain.
Ironically, that's in a way what happens in France, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's the ideology got spread over, didn't it? And then the British were like, "Oh my God, what is happening? We need to control this." So, yeah. American strengths. Washington survived and kept his army in the field. That was the most important thing. All he had to do was do that. They had better tactics for local battlefields because, of course, they had guerrilla tactics. They're from the continent. They knew how to operate there, so they could operate in a better way than the British armies. British armies, to be fair, weren't as bad in this war as they were in the 7 Years' War because they had learned a little bit tactically from their early experiences. So they were a little bit better, but still, you can't beat local militia who know the territory and know the style of fighting. I think Washington's counterattack at Trenton was really, really important for raising morale. We'll deal with Saratoga and Yorktown when we deal with individual, because we'll deal with individual elements of the war afterwards. So we'll go through it in order. We're just talking about strengths and weaknesses in general. I think the fact that he managed to improve his army's training at Valley Forge was really important, especially being trained by von Stauben, who was a Prussian general, because the Prussians were by far the best fighting force in the world at this point. I can't remember exactly how many shots, something like most armies could fire, was it 2 rounds a minute or one, and the Prussians could fire 3 or 4 or 5. I don't remember. It was like nearly double, if not more than double, the number of shots per minute, which in a firefight makes a massive difference if your army is able to shoot 2 or 3 times more shots per minute than the enemy. And that was why the Prussians in the 7 Years' War had managed to beat like Sweden, Russia, France, and Austria alone, and fought that for the British. So having that professional training by what was a superior army, because the Prussian army was superior to the British army. So therefore, Washington getting his soldiers trained by Prussians, I think, is quite important. I think Washington's leadership, his ability to absorb all the criticism and keep his army in the field, and keep the motivation up is really important. What do you reckon? Anything that you want to add to that, or things you think are really important?
No, I think that's right. I think that Washington just needs to hold on. Interesting. Isn't it interesting how history, I know this might sound a bit like a platitude, but history really hangs on personalities sometimes. If there was a different kind of man in that position who couldn't withstand those pressures, I mean, the course of history could be very different, I think.
I think even more important when we get to Unit 4 about whether there would have been a Napoleon if it was. I don't think Napoleon would have laid down his army or only stayed for 2.
No, that's right. And there's also that question. So you're referring. So Washington. He's a bit like a Cincinnatus, isn't he? You know the Roman general that goes back to his farm.
He's the Roman emperor that goes. No one else can find a single example between him and Washington of anyone doing it.
It's extraordinary.
The third was like he just gave up power, and twice. It's like what kind of man is this?
Yeah, he's a remarkable man.
And he just likes to hunt rabbits and chop down trees. He's got no interest in anything else.
And he had false teeth.
He's not a great thinker. So, not a great thinker.
But no, but that might be one of the reasons why he's so successful.
I think so, yeah, because he doesn't care. He's got no ideological game in this. He's just like, my country needs me, therefore I'll do it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, set that great precedent until FDR went, well, I'll just have as many terms as I like.
All right.
Do you think Trump models himself on Washington?
I was trying to imagine what would it be like if Trump was in Washington's position.
Oh God, no! I'm just imagining what Washington would think of Trump.
I think his wooden teeth would fall out.
Chop him down like a forest, have him knocked out. All right, cool. We'll finish that, and then we'll go on to the individual actions of the war. We'll talk about the significance of each individual stage, I think, because we've covered the base, weaknesses, and strengths. All right, cool. We'll end that one there.